There we go. Olá, boa tarde a todas e a todos. Estou aqui em representação do Semear o Futuro, desde de Portugal, né? Teremos connosco hoje Rob Wallace, uma pessoa bastante falada ultimamente por causa das questões da investigação sobre a pandemia, sobre o coronavírus. O Rob é um biólogo evolucionista marxista dos Estados Unidos, é um ativista da saúde pública e é autor de alguns livros, nomeadamente a Pandemia e Agronegócio, Doenças Infecciosas, Capitalismo e Ciência, em inglês Big Farms Make Big Flu, e recentemente um livro dedicado ao Covid-19 chamado Dead Epidemiologists. Ele foi consultor da ONU para a Alimentação e a Agricultura e também consultor do Centro de Controlo e Prevenção das Doenças Infecciosas nos Estados Unidos da América. Estuda o surgimento e a evolução de doenças infecciosas ao longo dos tempos, nomeadamente, por exemplo, o HIV, mas também, obviamente, nos últimos tempos, o Covid-19. E o Rob defende uma abordagem multidisciplinar à pandemia, colocando questões que misturam as ciências naturais e as ciências sociais, identificando as alianças entre as multinacionais, a agroindústria e as novas pandemias que têm surgido. É com muito prazer que nós fazemos esta entrevista com o Rob. Ela será conduzida em inglês e terá legendas para poderem acompanhar. Vou passar agora para a parte inglesa. Rob, thank you so much for being with us here today. It's a great pleasure that Semear has managed to set up this interview, and thank you so much for accepting. We're going to go ahead and do a few questions, and I will be conducting the interview along with Manel. Go ahead, Manel.
So, Rob, once again, thank you. And to begin our conversation, just a little question or a topic for us to talk about. In your book, Big Farms Make Big Flu, you explain the emergence of pandemic crisis is closely related to the expansion of intensive agriculture and the industrial food production centers. Can you explain how this mechanism works, this connection between the food and agriculture industry and the pandemic, this and others we have been seeing?
Yeah, I like how you started off with an easy question here, but I'll try my best. Well, you know, if I may, I'll start off with the beginning of humanity. I won't spend the entire time going through the history of agriculture here, but just to touch on a few things along the way. You know, when we began as a species, we merged out as hunter and gatherers, and we hunted out many of the large megafauna, and they weren't. We, in essence, almost drove ourselves into extinction. And so there's a little bottleneck in there, and so we began to cultivate various crops, but it wasn't merely a matter of innovation as an act of desperation, because so agriculture began that way as an act of desperation, and we began to cultivate all sorts of crops, but also began to engage in all sorts of husbandry, and that in essence changed, moved us in different directions and toward of what eventually became civilization and its various versions of it. And along the way, that led to, you know, the development of cities, the development of hierarchies, social hierarchies and such, the expansion of our the demographics, so explosion in population sizes and such. But along the way, all those civilizations along the way were in essence still constrained by the dependence on the local ecologies. So yeah, civilizations did crash and burn. You can name all sorts of number of them. I mean, you can go through whether it's the Roman Empire. I mean, there's controversy over Easter Island, whether that's the case or not, but Semear and all such like that. But in the end, whatever mode or model of social reproduction a civilization undertook was dependent on the local ecologies in which it was embedded. And so some civilizations gambled and they lost and they declined, but it was all dependent on still that relationship. Capitalism is a whole different thing. It's even from its very start, the basic premise is to produce a kind of gap between the economics of capitalist production and the ecology upon which it depends. So the entirety of it is organized around, in essence, producing profits and privatizing surplus value in a way that allows the billionaires to continue to accumulate wealth, no matter what happens to the rest of the planet. And that is a point of pride for the system in a way that is so destructive. And we can see the kind of divide between that model of economics and the ecological matrix upon which every civilization depends. And so, you know, you can see the folk like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, when they go off into space, it's a really wonderful symbol, a horrible, if also wonderful symbol of where we are, in which we have, you know, billionaires projecting themselves out into space, leaving Earth, as it were, much as the capitalist system itself has. So, you know, there are ways in which this has been summarized. You have Bruce F. Franklin's summary of it that other people have stolen, and it's a wonderful thing to steal. And he says something along the lines of that it's much easier to imagine the end of the earth than the end of capitalism. And we see the damage that has accumulated this way. And we see it in climate change, we see it in deforestation. And historically speaking, through the 500 years of capitalism, much of that damage was centered around the equator. You know, it's the global south suffers the damage imposed upon itself by the global north. And so so every year, millions of people die prematurely by virtue of the damage caused by this kind of extractivism. So, you know, global south typically is treated as both the refrigerator for the global north and as the toilet for the global north, in the sense of extracting all the resources, leaving all the damage there, and you know, and continuing on as the system goes. But the issue, of course, is that things like climate change and the pandemic are examples of which the damage is everywhere all at once now. And so it's only now that the global north has largely arrived at the shame and the terror of the system has accomplished, although it's also showing itself to be very good at pretending all this damage has nothing to do with the system, right? That's what the system does. It's very good at washing its hands of its complicity. But to circle back to your question, and I apologize, I tend to talk around things, but I do get to them, and I want to give some framework here, is that when you have an agricultural system that's based on the capitalist model and is industrialized, in essence, it extracts the basic resources upon which we all depend to survive as a species, and other species depend, and other species upon whom we depend as well. When that natural economy is destroyed or turned into an industrial economy, then all the things upon which we all depend in an ecological framework are lost. So that damage comes about in multiple ways, right? We have the pollutions of waterways, we have the pollution of air, we have destruction of local economies upon which peasants depend upon. So it's an environmental destruction, it's a social destruction. And now pandemics represent still another version of this. Industrial model is about trying to turn livestock and crops into as if you're making widgets in a factory, if you're making screws in a factory. and you want the animals to be all the same. You want them to be produced on a just-in-time economy. You want them to be raised in a way that you can actually ship them from one side of the world to the other. So in essence, you want them divorced from the ecologies upon which they typically are dependent upon. And if you want to think of a model that would be best to select for the most dangerous pathogen possible, that is the model upon which we arrived upon. And so, I mean, if you look at it at the level of the farm, you know, instead of having a mix of livestock and crops that provides a kind of natural agrobiodiversity that can act as a kind of immune fire break that keeps pathogens from lining up hosts, they're all the same now. So if a virus figures out a particular, you know, hog immune system, once it figures out that one immune system, it figures out the immune system of all the hog in there, because they're all the same. They're all genetically the same. They're all raised the same way, and they're all packed in together. So typically, in an industrial model, you have, say, like 15,000 turkeys in a single barn, or 250,000 egg layers in a barn, and they're all genetically the same. They're mushed together. So if you're a virus and you get in there, it's all food for flu, as it were, you know, or any other pathogen. Because once you solve that one immune system, you can burn right through them. Typically, if you're a pathogen, there's a kind of a cap on how much of a badass you can be, right? You can't kill your host too fast. If you kill your host too fast, then you can't transmit to the next host, right? So there's a certain timing that you have to do in terms of the evolution of virulence, or the amount of damage you do to your host. The thing is, if you pack in 15,000 birds all together, or 250,000 poultry all together, well, the next host is right there. So it ends up selecting for those pathogens that are actually replicating as fast as possible. And the faster they replicate, the more damage they do to the host, the more virulent they are, the deadlier they are, the more likely that can wipe out the entire barn. And because all barns are kind of mushed together in any region of a country, including, I would say, in Portugal, then it's real easy to spill over into the next barn. So there's always a nice, lovely supply of susceptibles that doesn't peter out. And so that selects for the most damaging, deadly of pathogens that can spill over over into humans, and has done so in a remarkable regularity since the kind of a livestock revolution began after World War II. I'm going to say one more thing, and I'm going to shut up a little bit. So, but I am trying to answer your question, and you did not start off easy. So, so the other thing to think about is that, you know, okay, you know, there are other aspects of the industrial production that basically select for the most damaging pathogens. Because if you think about it, you know, if you see photos of some of the barns that have been, you know, wiped out by some of the avian influenzas. I know in Europe a couple of years ago, you had some of the HXs burn through Europe and just about wipe out a lot of the industrial production. I think of the south of France in particular, but you know, if you have pictures of them, you see a couple birds still standing, and it might be, even though they have the same immune system, the same immunogenetics, they're genetically the same as the other birds that were killed, there might be some quirk in their biology in a way that allowed them to survive. Okay, so why don't we use those birds as the progenitors for the next generation? They have some immunity to it, so that would allow you to grow out another flock that would be immune to the pathogen that's still circulating. But under the industrial system, you don't do that at all. That's all breeding. No breeding is done on the farm. All breeding is done at the grandparent level, offshore, and in labs as a way of selecting for fast growth, for you know, a larger breast, all that stuff. So that in essence, there's no capacity that the farmer has to be able to engage and use natural selection in the farmer's favor to allow to you know, breed resistance on site against the pathogen that's still circulating. The last example, and I did say I was going to say one last thing, but I am going to say one last thing now, and that, because it really speaks to where the farmers are at, and I'm not exactly sure of the details in Portugal, but if it's not there yet, it's coming your way. And that's the American model of contract farming. Farmers are at this point totally beholden to their end buyers, to their integrators. Usually they're here in the States, there's a large 4 or 5 large agribusiness who control the entire meat supply. And it's a buyer dependent system, and the large companies tell the farmers how to raise the birds, the poultry, or the other livestock. And they give them the grain to feed the birds. They tell them what the kind of the dimensions of the barn they're to raise these birds in such a way that, in essence, contract farmers are in a kind of sharecroppers at this point. They don't have control of the nature of their farms, and it's built that way on purpose. And there was a Wall Street Journal reporter by the name of Christopher Leonard who came out with a book called on the meat production and the contract farming. And he showed that the large integrators pretty much figured out that raising birds in this way was completely a money loser. And, because they kept dying of all the diseases that came in, and this was like 40 years ago, they figured this out. And also all the stress pathologies, birds pecking at each other, having them all crammed in there like that. I'm not an animal rights guy, but clearly is an example in which people of different ethos can converge on something that we need to work on in terms of what we can do against this. And as I understand it, we'll circle around back to that. But my point is about the contract farmers is that the companies know growing these birds out this way is deadly and dangerous. And by contracting out the farmers, the growing out part of it, they in essence dump the losses that come out of producing this birds this way onto the contract farmers. So it's embedded into the system, not only as an ecological problem, but as a socialized problem in which the damage is externalized upon, in this case, the farmers, but also on the greater landscape, the destruction of natural forests, the polluting of waterways, all the things that we depend on in order to survive into the next generation. And so clearly capitalism is totally integrated into the notion of making money at the expense of our very species, including selecting for a pathogen that might emerge and kill 1 billion people. And COVID-19, I think, is an example of that, but we can talk about that in short order.
Thank you so much, Rob.
Thank you, Rob. In fact, I was going to ask you if you can. You gave us this incredible explanation because you came back to the origin of civilization, so it was quite short in time. But I was thinking if you can develop a little about how this, as far as we know, happened in the specific case of COVID-19.
Sure. And, again, I am going to have to circle around for a bunch of topics before we get there, but I think they'll speak. Knowing these other things will help us understand what happened with COVID-19. Our group of evolutionary biologists, epidemiologists, geographers, we've been kind of tracking the emergence of these new pathogens every couple of years since the turn of the century. I mean, it's every year we have a new celebrity virus that emerges that really grasps people's imagination. Everybody jumps online, looks up all the, its clinical course, its epidemiology, and these are all important details. But in the course of the question that is rarely asked and is why are these new pathogens emerging, right? So we had the beginning of the century, H5N1, that was the celebrity avian influenza that emerged out of China, but we've also have other pathogens, SARS-1 in 2002. You had, I'm not going to get the chronology right here, but I kind of skip around, but you had MERS, which was also a kind of coronavirus that emerged in the Middle East. You had H7N9, another avian influenza that had everyone worried that it might go human-human. all the H5 and X's that swept through Europe. We had H5N2 here in the United States. We had in 2009 swine flu H1N1 that emerged outside Mexico City in industrial hog there before it went pandemic. You had Ebola in West Africa emerged in 2013. You had Ebola in the Congo that emerged. That even with a vaccine proved to be, the longest running Ebola outbreak and recorded. And we came to the understanding, we kind of converged on kind of a general model about how these different pathogens, most of them are RNA viruses, but they're also quite different from each other in terms of their pathologies and their epidemiology and their host types and such. But there is a convergence of, we kind of came onto a notion about a way of organizing how all the different pathogens are emerging in this way. And so our view of it is you kind of think of it as a kind of a circuit of production. So you start off, you have a local regional capital here, a city, and that circuit kind of goes out all the way through the peri-urban landscape, kind of a combination of a kind of rural urban areas, and then all the way deep into a local forest, right? And so some of these pathogens are emerging right on the forest edge there. So you have something like Ebola is a good example, West Africa Ebola. Our group pinned the hypothesis for explanation of this on the kind of the emergence. We called it neoliberal Ebola, in part because the West Africa had been subjected to structural adjustment programs. IMF, World Bank basically said, if you want these loans, you're going to have to open up your economies to allow multinationals in. So that leads to the increase of deforestation, development of more kind of monocultural production. Think of palm oil, you think of macadamia, you have all sorts of other kind of crops that have been now are feeding the world market rather than locals who are engaged in hundreds, if not thousands of years of kind of agroforestry on their own. Well, the thing is, the forests are very complex environments, and they provide a means by which it's really hard for a pathogen to line up the host. You know how we described all the kind of industrial production? Well, in the forest, it's very hard to do that because you can be a deadly pathogen, but you can't line enough of your hosts up to be able to shoot out of the forest. And if anybody watching has actually been in a rainforest, you can understand the complexity. And I've been in a couple, and it's really dazzling. It's really unnerving in some ways because so many things going on, you can't keep track. And that's actually a beautiful thing because it really speaks to kind of the biodiversity involved, all the kind of, to use the reductionist term, the kind of ecosystem services that are provided by all the complex ecologies involved. And one of the things the forest does, I mean, it's not doing it for our sake, let's not be, so egotistical about it that they're working for humanity. They're not. It just happens to be the complexity of the forest acts as a way of keeping these most deadly pathogens from really spreading out. I mean, when you do have a spillover event, it's a terrible thing. So Ebola, post 1976, it would emerge. It would take out a village or two, 90% case fatality rate, or it would sweep through a guerrilla troop and really just devastate. It's a terrible thing. But it would basically end there, and that was it. And what's really weird about the Ebola that emerged in West Africa in 2013, genetically still very much the same. It's not dissimilar. It's it's the same epidemiological parameters, same mode of transmission. And, it was kind of a run of the mill of Ebola, but how does it go to infecting 35,000 people, killing 11,000 people, leaving bodies on the streets of regional capitals? How's that happening? And there's a particular Western reductionist vantage point of looking at causality in the object of things, like in the virus itself. Like it has to be the virus. In this case, it wasn't. So what is it? Well, causality, or how things cause and effect, extend out into the larger field. And so it's our notion that that field has very much changed as structural adjustment programs are imposed. You have the decline of public health programs, the decline of animal health programs by virtue of satisfying kind of external investors, and also the intergovernmental agencies providing these loans. And you also allow multinationals in. So they start to really rip through the forest. And what happens is that complex forest is actually turned into something very much more simple. And most of the hosts carrying the pathogens in that reservoir in the deep forest are basically lost. They also die out. But some of the hosts actually do much better, and they respond. They are not just going to roll over and die. And so the classic examples of this are geese, who here in North America, when their wetlands were destroyed along the Gulf of Mexico, a lot of the geese didn't just die. They looked up and saw all this wonderful grain being grown as far north as Minnesota here. And so those populations began to winter over in the farms where the grain was, and their populations exploded in size. And so, you have an increasing interface between these geese that are, natural reservoirs for the avian influenzas and the poultry there right up against them. And so you increase the spillover rates between these geese and these poultry. That's not only North America, that's in Europe as well. But the example is that of bats. Bats are incredibly plastic in terms of their behavior. And so when they started cutting into the West African forest that way, many of these bats migrated to these new monoculture plantations. And I mean, what's not to like? Beautiful plantation. There's nice space between the trees, and you can fly from your roosting site and your foraging site, and there are no predators. And so, their populations are doing quite well in the face of that. And of course, it increases the interface between these animals who are reservoirs for Ebola and the workers there. And it doesn't matter whether it's these frugivore bats or insectivore bats. You're in essence what multinational agribusiness does is, or logging or mining, is that it rips up the ecology, unplugs the ecological relationships, and then replugs them in such a way that we arrive at a moment where pathogens that were previously bottled up in natural forests are suddenly sprung open and allowed to spill over at a rate that they didn't do previously. Meanwhile, the locals who were doing hundreds of years of agroforestry are kicked out and are forced to, in very, Marx in England would recognize this. They're forced to migrate to the city for work because their land's been taken, but they do migrate back to help out with small family plots during the farming season. So you have your cycle migration going on. So any spillover event that happens on the forest edge quickly gets blown back up into the regional capital by virtue of this cycle migration. So that's the forest end of it. We already talked about the other end of it. We talked about the industrial farming that's increasingly emerging outside cities as a way of supplying food for not only for locals in the city, but also on the world market. And then there are pathogens like some of the avian influenzas, the swine influenzas are emerging in that direction. I gave the example of swine flu H1N1, which we call the NAFTA flu after the North American Free Trade Agreement. As you can probably tell, I'm very popular with my my colleagues because I name pathogens after politicians and political things. In part of it is in sarcastic jest, but part of it is to really underline the important point that, focusing on the molecular biology of a pathogen completely misses out on what is actually driving the emergence of these pathogens in the first place. So if I call the British strain that emerged of COVID-19 the Bojo strain after Boris Johnson, it's not just a caricature. It is a really important point that if you're going to engage in kind of neoliberal public health and you refuse to actually engage in the Tetris, the testing, tracing, and isolation necessary to keep a pathogen from emerging, and you allow the pathogen to spread about, and therefore by infecting more people, engage in essence, with each infection, you in essence open up a new laboratory for the pathogen, and the pathogen is able to experiment with the immune system in such a way that it evolves these new variants that all of a sudden are able to emerge out beyond, engage in immune escape and emerge out beyond the coverage that the vaccines provide, or become a little bit more infectious, become a little bit more deadlier. If you're engaging that the world over, then you've set up a situation where such a pathogen emerges. And it's not you could do things like other nations have done, whether it's China, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's New Zealand, all very different politically speaking, but they took governance seriously enough to say, hey, you know, we're going to stop this thing and keep the pathogen from spreading, or you can just let it rip through your population and allow the most deadly pathogen to emerge, as we're all discovering with the Delta variant presently. My point is about, you know, naming them in this way is to, you know, draw attention to the kind of the social context in which these pathogens are responding. And so we call the NAFTA flu after the North American Free Trade Agreement, because once the trade agreement brought down the kind of trading barriers that allowed large meat companies in the US to meat dump on the Mexican market, destroy the domestic Mexican market, as a way that either the small hog producers there had to either sell off to the large companies coming in, or actually combine, consolidate in such a way that they were large producers, middle, or at least middle-level producers that could compete with the new multinationals that have moved in. But that changed hog production in profound ways in Mexico. And it's not any surprise whatsoever that a pathogen that is in essence with the genetics of influenzas from both North America and Eurasia, suddenly converged upon a phenotype, a characteristic that was able to go human to human and be a pandemic that we hadn't seen for so long. We don't remember it very well because you have 500,000 killed, not that many, it seems. But, you know, in other words, these dynamics have already occurred where in the course of allowing kind of a capitalist agribusiness to encroach on forests and such, it is vastly accelerating the means by which new pathogens are spilling over. Now, let's get on to COVID-19, which was the point of your question, right? But it's important to get this framework because now we know, because COVID-19 is actually a mix of those two. On that circuit of production there, it's not just a matter of farming outside of cities. It's not a matter of just a forest edge. Our view of it is that in all likelihood, this emerged in a kind of combination along the way. And so we kind of get into a little bit of the history of China. I won't go into the beginning, just to say that post-Mao, they went the BRICS route, you know, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa made a decision that they were going to do capitalism their way as a way of pushing back against the kind of global north of the Europe and the US view of how to do capitalism. In other words, they were going to develop their own resources. They were going to engage in their own sub-imperiums in terms of exploiting other countries. And I'm not going to get into a whole discussion about whether that was the right move, but they moved hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. They also left millions of people behind in poverty as well. But in the course of developing their own resources, they engaged in the kind of deforestation that we've talked about that led to the spillover events. So SARS-1 emerges in 2002, all likelihood in the course of you know, encroaching upon the kind of forest areas of South and Central China. You have you know, post SARS-1, there was a lot of ecological and genetic analysis done on the bats that were the natural hosts for these coronaviruses. And you have all sorts of coronaviruses across all sorts of types of species of bats across South and Central China. And, you know, we have SARS-1, we have MERS, although that was in the Middle East, and we have SARS-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19. And we also have a variety of coronaviruses that did spill into humans that weren't as deadly that were also recognized. But if you think about it, we have 3 major deadly coronaviruses emerged within only 18 years. That really speaks to the kind of barrage upon which we're being set upon with all these kind of coronaviruses that's spilling over into human populations that weren't recognized previously. And it really speaks to the acceleration and the lengths to which the kind of encroachment on the forest for capitalist agribusiness and logging and mining has profoundly changed the kind of epidemiologies and ecologies in a way that all likelihood this SARS-2 also emerged this way. In all likelihood down in Yunnan, which is a southwest province in China that also served Guangdong and Yunnan down there appear to be the point of origin for SARS-1, and all likely also the origin for SARS-2. The follow-up question, of course, is how did it emerge in Wuhan there that way? It had nothing to do with the army games there. It unlikely emerged specifically out of the fish market there, or the livestock market there. Kind of the genomics of the virus indicates that it probably was circulating in humans for many years. And before in much of the way that we described the kind of Ebola stuff, it eventually is able to experiment with the human immune system enough that it allows itself to go human to human over several years, and begins to develop increasing momentum to reach further north up into Wuhan before it goes human to human, and we know the story from there. Now, there is also a second hypothesis, and that has to do with the lab leak theory of disease emergence. And, oftentimes we're put in a place to actually choose one or the other. I don't choose one or the other. Well, no, I am more of a proponent of the kind of field hypothesis that SARS-2 in all likelihood, with the thousands of animals upon which it could splatter across, the typical livestock, the wild food species like civets and pangolin, the humans, that is a much broader experimental lab table upon which it can figure out how to solve the human immune system, go human to human. The lab leak theory is much more specific about dates and times and stuff, but it actually is put in a position and as more of a kind of it views causality in terms of more kind of detective work rather than natural science. And I'm not opposed to it. I just don't, I have in my head, not actual numbers, but I err on the side of it being more than likely that it was a field emergence. But a lab leak is not out of the realm of possibility. In fact, in Big Farms Make Big Flu, I describe work done by a group out of Princeton University that mapped all the labs that the BSL 3 and 4 labs, the biosafety labs 3 and 4 that do the most dangerous work, post H5N1 and post 9/11. Thousands of these new labs were built, increasingly across more in the Middle East and Eurasia, but everywhere around the world, these labs are built. And even a rare event like a lab leak, which has been documented elsewhere, even a rare event, when you give it that many opportunities, as it will bend toward inevitable. So the notion that there's a lab leak is indeed a possibility. I just don't think, as you can see, everyone's rushing to come to an answer, in part because it's part of the new Cold War. How do we blame China? How do we blame the US? Is it, it took 15 years to figure out how SARS-1 emerged. In all likelihood, it might take less time because people are pressed for finding an answer to it. But I think presently, the focus on the two hypotheses actually misses a point in which it's not that it doesn't matter whether it emerged by field, out in the field or in the lab. It's that both efforts to try to block the virus actually miss the entire point of what we've been discussing all today so far, right? If you're focusing on farm biosecurity, you're basically saying, I want to continue to do industrial production this way. I just want to be able to filter out my pathogens at the farm gate. If you're focusing on the lab leak thing, all those labs were about trying to either stop the pathogen from emerging in the first place or cleaning up the mess after it does emerge. But both proponents for both hypotheses are actually engaged in trying to avoid the conversation that we're having here today, which is the kind of economic production that we've chosen to engage in, the means by which we feed people, increasingly under the capitalist model, is so destructive that the emergence of these pathogens, one after the other, on an annual and even almost on a semi-annual basis at this point, or is becoming so daunting that we have no other option than to kind of revisit the notion of how we produce food and for whom and how and in what way. But it's a conversation that all that noise you hear about in between the various proponents are trying to avoid talking about, because they want to be able to keep the system going as it presently is.
Thank you so much for that deep dive there, Rob. Just to build up a little bit off what you were saying now here at the end, sometimes, well, I think for most people it's difficult to imagine a different model of organization or a different world, let's put it like that. We would like to know also, in your opinion, what changes can be made to food production and its relations with the ecosystems in order to prevent these type of pathogens and pandemics coming to life.
Yeah, I was born in New York City, but now I live here in the Midwest, here in the United States, and I must be taking on some of the characteristics here because I have the notion of very pragmatic interventions come to the fore first when you have this kind of conversation. And then, of course, the pragmatic stuff isn't enough, right? Because the big systemic things need to be changed as well, because no one interested in making $1 billion off food would be interested in the pragmatic stuff of keeping a pathogen from killing 1 billion people. So that's why. So let's start off with the pragmatic stuff, right? So I talked about at the beginning there, all the damage that the industrial production does in terms of selecting for a pathogen that might emerge and kill so many people. And the answer is, well, we reversed all that, right? So we don't grow 15,000 turkey in the same barn or 250,000 layers, right? We're not going to produce poultry that much. Does that mean we're in all likelihood going to eat less meat? Probably, but not in a way that, most of the meat that's produced in many of the industrial countries are for export, right? So it's about making money. It's not about feeding people, right? So, so in essence, you have to move out of an industrial economy. Agriculture has to be returned to some aspect of a natural economy, and that the animals and crops that we raise are integrated into the local landscapes in a way that the inputs should become largely locally, and the outputs, meaning some of the waste stuff isn't so awful that it poisons the water or the people working there. So there's an aspect of respecting local natural landscapes and the people who live there. But more pragmatically, in terms of the livestock specifically, we're going to increase the diversity of animals, both within any one species and the species together. So farms are going to be, and it might differ from place to place how we actually do this. That would involve actually talking and working with the people who live there. They may have some very good ideas about how farming goes. They've been farmers for many generations. So there's an aspect of so increasing the biodiversity of the animals, in allowing them to breed on site, right? We talked about how that is not possible under the industrial model. And, the funny thing is, like, all the things I described is just basically what smallholders and peasants do around the world already, right? So it's not like reinventing the wheel, right? When I talk to this about small farmers, they're like, oh yeah, you're just describing what we do. And I said, that's right, that's the point. So you allow the animals to breed on site. So if you do have an outbreak, those that survive can already are selected for the resistance to the circulating pathogen. If you have all the biodiversity and you have all these diverse genetics across the landscape, they act as a way that if you do have a pathogen that emerges and wipes out a barn, it can't solve the immune system one barn over because it's very different from the thing that it figured out. We can get into those are very obvious, easily pragmatic interventions that are absolutely, utterly strike at the heart of industrial production. No industrial company would ever allow that to happen under their model, because they're all about, just-in-time production. They're about economies of scale, producing thousands of millions of birds for, raising them in 6 weeks for, supplying a city on the other side of the world, right? So all this involves kind of moving toward a more kind of local regionalism. It doesn't mean the end of world trade. It just means a little bit different way of doing things. And by reintegrating agriculture back into local landscapes, then that kind of damage we refrain from that kind of damage, and not only selecting for the most deadly of pathogens, but also returning respect for the landscape that allows waterways to be clean. Presently in the United States, but elsewhere, a lot of rural areas are treated as sacrifice zones for agribusiness production. They're just completely wiped out, not only in terms of the natural environment, but the people there are treated just about as slaves. And that involves moving toward a notion of healing what's called the metabolic rift, the rift between ecology and economy in such a way that those two things speak to each other, are integrated. And it's not just an ecological program, it's a political program, because the poor and working class of the city have much in common with the rural peoples in terms of the damage that they are subjected to. And in essence, political parties across the global north engage in a kind of divide and conquer to keep peoples who are living in different areas along our circuit of production there from actually realizing that actually there's a lot that we have in common. You can see the kind of political damage, certainly here in the United States. I'm sure you have your Portuguese versions of it. Here, both business parties. We have only one ruling party, but in a very American way, it's quite grandiose. We have two wings of a same ruling party, and they divide the electorate in a way that the Democrats typically take cities and the Republicans typically take the outstates, even though Republicans crap on farmers all over the place. So the point is to try to kind of heal that damage and move in a direction, politically speaking, of the long old questions of how do the proletariat and the peasantry work together, and the terrible demands that it requires, and that what that involves. Their efforts here in the U.S. and elsewhere of trying to heal those rifts. There are liberals here who engage in the kind of organizations kind of like from hood to holler, hood as in neighborhood, as in the urban areas, holler is a kind of a rural thing. But there are all sorts of, the requirement, it requires a kind of different vantage point of making more of a kind of eco-socialist intervention, that it isn't merely a matter of, we reject the kind of eco-modernist vantage point of that the only thing we have to do is socialize the factories. The problem is that the modes of production are the means by which the relations of production are imposed and kept in place. It does matter how we produce energy. It does matter the ways in which we produce food. It's not merely a matter of letting the workers run things, although that's incredibly important, but also to better integrate how our way of being as humanity must be reintegrated into the ecological matrix. So we go from a very practical interventions like fewer chickens, let them breed on site, to the bigger picture of that simple intervention is so problematic for a system organized around monetizing everything in such a way that you have these kind of ratchets of production in which many farmers are caught into, and they can't get out by virtue. You use pesticides, now you got to use this pesticide resistant plant, then the pests evolve against it, so now I need this new pesticide from the company now I'm entirely dependent on, both as my supplier and also as my end buyer. And so this beautiful intervention, the really practical way, is foundationally constrained by the broader political context of basically, in the end, really a sociopathic system. I mean, it doesn't matter how well groomed or shaved or spoken many of the bourgeoisie are, particularly the richest among us. It doesn't matter. I mean, if you're based on if you're operating a system on the basis of the notion that we can run an economy of infinite growth on a finite planet, even a planet that is wonderful in that it's able to reproduce itself on a regular basis. If we allow our way of living and being in the hands of people who are perfectly willing and able to use their power to destroy any other effort, a way of living that involves respecting the planet and upon which we all depend on, then inevitably we are moving toward an extinction event. Unless we develop the kind of political organization necessary to defeat these people. And when I say defeat them, I'm not saying merely in arguing online or in the seminar room or over in Davos or any of that. You have to start unplugging yourselves out of that kind of context and begin organizing in a way that represents a truly independent approach that is aiming for defeating the bourgeoisie, because they are perfectly happy and willing to destroy the planet. They're sociopaths, they're out of their minds. And it really requires finding a way of unplugging out of that and beginning to organize. And it's a ridiculous quest in some ways, right? And we're talking about coming in on an extinction event, and it's highly unfair to the generation coming up, and the notion that it's a generational project. It's incredibly difficult, and it's going to require such bravery and courage that perhaps humanity has not seen yet. So, but that's where we are. That's the place we are.
Well, thank you a lot once again, because, well, from this point we could go on, and we agree a lot with this perspective, and it's what we are trying to do with our small organization, without passing too much of the time we agreed on. I will try to make here just another topic to shift a little bit from the origin of the problem and the more global picture, let's say, to the emergency situation we are in, and all things related with the vaccine problem. As we can see, as we read, you are in favor of the vaccine, as we understood, but always pointing that is not like a miraculous solution, and it has a lot of problems. Ideological problems, like this idea of there is always a technology that will save us from the problems of the capitalism, but also, and this is related with some study that came some days ago that says that, and you commented online, that almost for sure there will be there will emerge a new variant that can break the current vaccine, as I understood, because we have simultaneously millions of people vaccinated and millions of people not vaccinated, and this will allow the virus to test solutions to break the immunity. So what in this point, and without losing the big picture of changing the origin of the problem, what can we do about this?
Yeah, I mean, it's there's so much to talk about, and I will try to respect the time that we allotted ourselves. But it's although the left has had a long history of doing two things. Well, I mean, a lot of things, but what comes to mind here, the notion of fighting for the right of people to get everyone has the right, the access to the latest medical innovation. And the vaccine thing is an obvious example, right? Even as it was produced by multinational companies, that all that work was, the research that went into it was paid by governments around the world. And, you know, and for the most part, they do work. And everyone around the world has a right to that. The WHO at the beginning of the year was on a track of actually moving toward what's called open medicine and having the vaccine available to everyone. You know, we talked about the sociopaths. We talked about that to tie into our previous discussion, the Bill Gates, who has influence on WHO up into the executive committees up there, intervened in a way that COVAX, which is the now program dedicated to having at least 20% of, you know, the bottom financially globally, the 20% that don't have access to get vaccines. He made sure that we would not have open medicine, that intellectual property rights would be protected in a way that, and that the companies that have the vaccines would be able to negotiate country to country in such a way that they would still continue to make considerable amount of money. In other words, it's completely violating the very spirit of what the open medicine would be, which is to try to get in as many people vaccines into their arms as possible, so that we can engage in a race with the virus in such a way that if we can get to herd immunity at the level of the globe, we have a good chance of actually, you know, driving COVID at least down to what's called extirpation, meaning an extinction event, at least in the short term. But we didn't do that. We were so interested in protecting the intellectual property rights of the pharmaceutical companies that we made sure that we did not get the vaccines into people around the world. And so we allow, exactly as you described, the virus to continue to evolve and spread out there and come up with solutions to various problems, to come up with the new variants that are more infectious, that are increasingly deadly, and also ones that are beginning to chip away at the efficaciousness of the vaccines. So that's the other thing. So on the one hand, one thing we must do is to make sure, push back against the Gates of the world and fight and destroy intellectual property rights in that way. You know, the music recording industry, Hollywood came up against it because it's too much of a precedence that would basically say that the largest companies in the world have a right to, you know, hold on to these properties, even if it means, in this case, the deaths of millions of people. And this is where we get back to the sociopathy of it and the necessity of truly pushing back against them, however cultured they may seem. The second thing that the left has often done is saying that, yes, these medical innovations are necessary, but they're not sufficient. They are not the means by which enough to destroy COVID-19. And we see this here in the United States. You know, it wasn't just, you know, Trump who put 500,000 Americans in the ground, you know, killed them by virtue of doing nothing about COVID-19. Biden comes in and just rides the vaccine horsey, and he allows all the other things, the Tetris, the testing, tracing, isolation, the non-pharmaceutical interventions have been actually completely laid aside. And so none of that was actually, all that was dropped, and the vaccine itself wasn't good enough. Sorry, I'm having a little feedback here. So that none of it, you know, the vaccine wasn't good enough to be able to stop the outbreak. And certainly when Delta arrived here and began to not just spreading across the unvaccinated, and they try to spin this in a way to blame the unvaccinated for not taking the vaccine. In the US and elsewhere, I think Russia, but you'll find them everywhere, including Europe. You have these huge demonstrations in Europe against the vaccine, against the lockdowns and all that. It's basically So in that end of it, there isn't not enough people have been vaccinated. But on the other hand, there's an aspect of a complete, if we had if we were not able to engage in the kind of non-pharmaceutical interventions, those networks are also necessary to get people vaccinated. And here in the US and increasingly elsewhere, public health is in decline. In the US, we went the neoliberal route. We monetized public health, or we neglected it in such a way that we don't even understand even the concept of public health at this point. And so there's very little, considering how rich the US is, very little money dedicated to doing the things necessary to get everyone vaccinated. So in essence, vaccination wasn't ever going to be enough of this. And so among the public health vote, what's known as a Swiss cheese model, where you have a layer of Swiss cheese and you keep doing layers and layers of Swiss cheese on top, so that the holes in the first slice are covered up by the cheese on the layer that's put on top, in such a way that by doing all those things, yes, vaccination, but also the contact tracing, the testing, when necessary, the kind of isolation, it could be done in a very time-specific way. The city's doing well, we can open up a little bit. But when there seems to be an encroaching outbreak coming, we'll have to kind of roll back. We don't wait until the damn thing's already here. And that's the thing that is completely lost. I try to think in terms of six weeks out. Here in the United States, mid-March is when the lockdowns began, but the genetic sequencing showed that the the SARS-2 had arrived on US shores 6 weeks previously, if not earlier. And that's when you start to actually engage in the activities necessary to keep COVID-19 from exploding, because if you wait too late, you're never gonna be able to hold it down. So, in the end, it really gets into the notions of, one, yes, we are in favor of medical innovations, but two, they should not be treated as commodities by which people can make money off them. They weren't, the R&D that went into that was paid by people around the world, and it wasn't paid by the companies. So it's not theirs. And so we had to take it from them. And so that's the expropriators must be expropriated, right? We must take that from them. It's a terrible thing, 4 million, maybe 10 times of that have died from COVID-19. And the terrible thing is that it's really, as far as deadly pandemics go, really not that bad. Increasingly more are on their way, more new pathogens are emerging. Nobody wants to have to face an outbreak that kills 50% of the people infected, right? So we are in a dangerous situation that even something that is ostensibly handleable, we can handle, 1%, 2% case fatality rate is actually something that the world over, except save a few countries and a few provinces has miserably failed in terms of being able to intervene in there. In the end, really, it's going to call for global solidarity. I mean, this is what it is. I mean, so it comes down to. So in order to expropriate the expropriators, you have multinational companies that are operating at the intergovernmental level, that's WHO, at the UN, across, at the various, WTO, all this decision-making happening. And the only way that could be defeated is that if peoples around the world start to work together in that direction. And so it's absolutely, utterly necessary that we do have these conversations across countries and begin to actually plot through, well, what does I was going to say multinational, but I didn't mean it that way. But what does a multi-country and global solidarity look like in a way that allows us to push back against these people? And it's a difficult moment because we are living in such an era of what's called capitalist realism, that the very premises of natural reality is presumed, it's looked through the lens of that the starting premise of anything involves, how do I make the boss man richer? And it's a terrible thing because so many around the world have also accepted those premises. Some of it out of having to survive in the face of paying bills and stuff, which is totally understandable. But the propaganda has been so effective that, and there's been some work in that direction. I mean, some of the anthropologists and sociologists have actually, traced back, going hundreds of years it took capitalists to inculcate people around the world with its premises. And so that, it's been so terribly effective that thinking through about how to unplug people out of that, it's going to be a generational project. So 1, we're running out of time. 2, it's still a generational project. 3, we have to work locally for sure, and also start to look working globally, and to do so from a spot of relatively political weakness, but also the politics are changing. History is not etched in stone, and people are coming to grand understandings, if by dint of their lived experience, that the way things are going cannot continue. And I think we can draw a lot of strength and hope out of that. And finally, there have been millions of people for the last 500 years who have very much opposed the present system, and they've shown the way, whether they're indigenous groups or smallholders or working people around the world, very much understood that this was all bull from the start. And frankly, we should start to look to peoples, to the global South that have a lot of understanding of these dynamics, even as the global South is developing, and even as there are parts of the global North that are de-developing. It gets quite complicated, but that doesn't mean that we can't find the way to work together to save us from this mess.
Thank you so much, Rob. I mean, there's so many, we had so many questions to ask you, so many things that we wanted to explore. We also don't want to impose too much on your time, obviously. I mean, there's so many different topics that we could have gone through, different government policies. You did speak about it a bit, but, the whole COVID denial that we've been living through lately, that's obviously quite worrying for the world. The fact that the pandemic isn't going away, even with the vaccination and everything else, the lack of public healthcare, even the different inequalities that have been so evident throughout this pandemic. It's been such an enriching conversation, and we really, really want to thank you for taking the time out to come and talk to us, and for giving us so many lights, let's put it like that, into these difficult topics that we've been facing. And I think we'll leave it like that, so we don't take any more of your time. I don't know if my fellow interviewer would like to say anything. Manel?
Just thank you a lot. Portugal is a small country, and many of these debates don't get here, but we try a lot to read what you and other thinkers write and speak, and translate it into action, into local and internationalist actions. So it's what we are doing. So thank you a lot, and maybe I hope we have another opportunity one of these days. So thank you all.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for inviting me and for your wonderful questions. And maybe one day I'll learn to shut my mouth and we can actually have a conversation sometime. But it's been a great pleasure. So thank you very much, and let's keep in touch.
Yes, muito obrigado.
Yes, obrigado.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay, take care. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.